Thank you all for coming. You do know, of course, that by virtue of being here, you have become major donors to our cause. You laugh. Think about it. You are donating your only truly non-renewable resource to our cause. And what is that? Your time. And when we finish up in about an hour and a half, you will be 90 minutes closer to your death. And you're not going to get back this time. And I want to honor you for that. And I don't take it for granted at all. We all laugh and joke, but actually, it's what we do with our time really represents our deepest priorities and values. So the fact that you are here is no little thing. And I want to work hard with you to make it a worthwhile use of your time, an investment of your time. That's my plan. I'm going to talk for a bunch, and then there'll be some time for question and answer. So, just as we get going, some information. Firstly, this is not political in the sense of I'm not stumping for a political party, for a particular political party or plan. I describe us as a multi-partisan movement. We'll talk about that as we go. The second point to make is, if you're a Christian, this will make sense to you. If you're not religious, just ignore the next minute or two. This does not prescribe or depend upon any particular eschatology. So eschatology is the doctrine or the thinking about how the world ends. And every group has particular visions of how the world ends and explanations. And in some Christian circles, people love arguing about how it's all going to end and working out a detailed timeline. And Christians have discussed this and debated this for millennia, as has the Jewish community. And within that framework, people have different understandings of the role of the Jewish people, the role of Israel, the role of the temple, the role of red heifers, all kinds of things, right? We're not going to cover any of that. And it doesn't matter what you believe about any of that for the purposes of tonight. If you ask me very nicely and become a major donor financially, I may tell you what I believe. Absent those two things, I won't, because I don't think it's useful to our cause. Make sense? Okay, here's where we're going tonight. We're going to look at why this matters. We're going to look at Christian anti-Semitism. We're going to look at 20th century anti-Semitism, then we're going to look at Islamic anti-Semitism, and then we're going to think about what we can do about it. Why this matters? Obviously, after Bondi, the fact that we have people in our country who would murder other Australians because they are Jewish is a major problem. Anti-Semitism has re-emerged in a way that we 10 years ago would have thought extraordinarily unlikely here in Australia. It is now, you can now say things about Jewish people that even 3 years ago would have been unmentionable, but now you can say it. And what we saw at Bondi, and what I've been talking about for the last few years, is that the clash of civilizations has come to Australia. There was a book written by Samuel Huntington about 25 years ago of that same title, The Clash of Civilizations. And he argued that the 21st century would be characterized not by a clash between nation states, but by civilizational clashes. That's what we're seeing in Israel, by the way. It's a clash of civilizations. That's what's going on in Iran at the moment. It's a clash of civilizations. And that clash has come to Australia, and on December the 14th, it went kinetic on Bondi Beach. And so we have to grapple with that. And it's a terribly uncomfortable thing to grapple with for us Aussies. We've lived on a great big island, and you all live on a little island. But we're an island people of migrants who've come to this country, and we've managed to create, I would say, one of the world's most harmonious multi-ethnic communities, where we come from all parts of the world, and we get along with each other. And not since 1942 in Darwin have we had war or violence perpetrated by another country or civilization on our soil, but we had that in Bondi on December the 14th. And that is a shock to Australians who have thought for a very long time that all these problems happen over there, a long way away. Friends, they're here. And this means we face a great spiritual and moral danger. It's not just that some Jews over there on the mainland are having a hard time. Anti-Semitism is about the soul of this country, what will define us, what we will allow in our country to take root. Some of you know the story, and Chris alluded to it. On October the 9th, 2023, 2 days, less than 48 hours after the massacre, the greatest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, my daughter Freya called me from Sydney Uni, where she was studying, and said, "Dad, the pro-Palestinians are planning a rally in Town Hall. We've got to do something about it." I always do what Freya says. And so I called the station commander at Sydney Police Station, and I said, "Look, there's unauthorized rallies happening. I want to do something about it." And the station commander said to me, "Mr. Leach, we're advising the Jews to stay out of the city today." Bear in mind, this was the day they were going to light up the sails of the Opera House in solidarity with the Jewish community. No, we're keeping the Jews out of the city today. Secondly, if you come into the city, we can't guarantee your safety. These are the police whose wages are paid by our taxes. And thirdly, if you come in and try and do anything, we will arrest you. So, look, I'm a migrant. I've been here 30 years. I've picked up some of the vernacular. So I hung up the phone and I thought out loud, "Bugger that." And I put on my clerical shirt, looked all religious. I took my squash bag. I played squash, took a big Israeli flag, rolled it up, went into the city and walked around in, I don't know if Sydney at all, but these rallies all start between the town hall and the Anglican cathedral. There's a square there. So I walked around and the people were very happy to see me in the crowd. They thought, "Oh, here's a clergyman, an Anglo clergyman coming to support us. Father, good to see you." I said, "Habibi, good to be here, Habibi." And then they started with their rally. And I've been to these things over many years, and the rallies are full of cries for the ethnic cleansing of Israel from the river to the sea, for the destruction of the Jewish state, for the destruction of the Jewish people. And when I heard a group of them crying, "Kill the Jews," I thought, well, that's enough. So I pulled the Israeli flag out of my bag and I stood on the steps of the cathedral, and with about 1,000 people around me, I waved the flag of Israel. I was surrounded by a group of keffiyeh-wrapped thugs who chased me out of the square. I beat a hasty retreat up Bathurst Street, ran and hid behind a police van on George Street while they dispersed about 15 or 20 of these guys who were threatening to slit my throat. And people said to me, "Mark, why did you do that?" In fact, the assistant commissioner of police in a meeting I had with him later drew me aside and he said, "Oh, you were the guy who did that. Why did you do that?" And I'm like, okay, I didn't do it just as an act of solidarity with Israel, though it was that. I didn't do it just as an act of solidarity with the Jewish community, though it was that. I said I did it for the soul of this country, because this is not us. We are not a country where we cede the center of our city to hate-filled jihadists who would persecute and kill Australians because of who they are. We do not want that ancient hatred in our country dividing our country. And I thought someone has to stand up and draw attention to this hatred, because I knew on that day that once the IDF went into Gaza, the propaganda machines funded by Iran and Qatar and North Korea and China and Russia would go into overdrive, the bots would fill our algorithms, and all hell would break loose on the Jewish community in Australia and around the world. And I knew on that day, as the ghosts of pogroms past stalked the streets of Sydney, I knew the very real risk for Australia was that we would repeat the mistakes of the Christians in Germany in the 1930s. And what did they do? Maybe 20% of the Christians supported Hitler. Maybe 20% of the Christians opposed Hitler. The problem was the middle 60%. And what did they do? Nothing. What was the most common day in Germany in the 1930s and 40s for rounding up Jews to go to concentration camps? What day of the week do you think the authorities would do? Saturdays? No. Sundays. Why Sundays? Well, because all the Christians were in churches like this, singing their songs, and the authorities encouraged the pastors to keep their people in church through the whole morning, singing their songs, having a great old time worshiping their God, so they wouldn't get in the way of their neighbors being taken off to death camps. Now, let me be clear, I don't think we're about to see concentration camps for Jewish people in Australia. But all the pieces are in place for the systemic, countrywide, embodied pogromification of our culture, where people in this country and around the Western world turn against our Jewish community. And I was saying this 2.5 years ago, it's not a matter of if but when Jewish people in this country are killed. And it's happened. So this is a testing time for Australia, for our national soul. How a country and a community treats its Jewish community is a window into its soul. It's a lead indicator of the kind of culture and civilization it is, and the evil that it will either tolerate or expel from its midst. We face testing times, dear friends. That's why it matters. Let's give you a definition. What is anti-Semitism? This is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA definition. It has been adopted by our federal government. It is used all around the world. And it says this: anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. It all sounds pretty benign. The definition then gives a whole lot of examples, and you may not be able to read these, but don't worry, you can look at them on a website, and I make the slides available to those who come. But it's things like this. So point 2, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. And oh my goodness, aren't we hearing that everywhere? From Jenny Lung, the Greens member in the state parliament in New South Wales, talking about the tentacles of the Jewish people, to half the MAGA base in the US, talking about the Israel lobby and the influence the Israel lobby has had, and the fact that the only reason the US is going into war with Iran is because of Bibi Netanyahu and the Jews controlling the US government. That is an anti-Semitic trope that implies the Jews control everything. And there's a whole lot more here, including, for example, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And on it goes. Now, it's important to make the point, there's a difference between criticism and anti-Semitism, right? So legitimate critique of the state of Israel is not demonization, right? In fact, legitimate critique of a Jewish person is not demonization. No Jewish person I know claims to be above criticism. In fact, if you go to Israel, and I would suggest you should, I think it would benefit every person to go to Israel at least once in their life. If you go to Israel, you'll discover it is an extraordinarily vibrant democracy. Like, they protest their government all the time. I have these debates with people, like, oh, Netanyahu's so terrible, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, well, go to Israel and you'll discover half the country thinks he's terrible as well, and they protest against him and they close down the city because it's this wonderful democratic country where Jewish people criticize each other and themselves and the state. That's fine. That's different from demonizing the state of Israel, calling them genocidal baby killers, that their intentions are evil, and holding them, secondly, to double standards, to standards that you would not hold any other country or people group to, and then blaming them for what's happening over there. This tests my patience, I've had friends, smart people, talking about Bondi, for example, and going, yes, Bondi terror, Gaza. So somehow it's the Jews in Australia are collectively responsible for what is purported to be war crimes in Gaza, a war in the Middle East, over which they have no control and they play no part. It's extraordinary. We don't do that to any other people group. Do you see Russian churches being burnt down because of what Putin is doing in Ukraine? I haven't seen that. No Russians being targeted, murdered. But the Jews, fair game. Okay, that's the intro. Let's dive into Christian anti-Semitism. And as we start with that, I want to make this very important point. In my view, and look, we can discuss this and debate it, and you may think I'm wrong, and that's fine. But my view is that anti-Semitism is a bug, not a feature of biblical Christianity. Again, what do I mean by that? This metaphor comes from software, and it's obviously not a good metaphor if you've got to explain the metaphor, but basically it means if you write a piece of software code and it does what it's meant to do, then that thing that it's meant to do is a feature. But if it does something you don't want it to do, that's a bug, and you want to get rid of it. I would say, and I will argue and defend to my last breath, that hating Jewish people is not a feature of biblical Christianity. You just can't. And that is vitally important because our opponents on both the radical left and the Islamist side will make the argument that Christianity is anti-Semitic. And look how wonderfully harmonious the Middle East was when Jews lived at peace under Islam, but under Christianity you had the Crusades, and Christianity is fundamentally anti-Semitism. That is not true. However, it's grounded in a couple of things. One is it's grounded in the misreadings of a whole bunch of scriptures. And just a little, what I'm going to do in the seminar is really deal mostly with the core texts of both Christianity and Islam. So if you aren't familiar with these texts, feel free to go and look them up online if you're not religious. These are core parts of the Christian scriptures that have been used in the early church to justify dividing the church, the Jewish Christians from the Jewish non-Christians. So Matthew 27:25, when Jesus he's on trial, the Jewish leaders say his blood will be upon us and on our children. So the Jews are always collectively guilty for the death of Jesus. Of course, it was actually the Romans who killed Jesus, so we should all hate the Italians. Only joking for the purposes of hate speech laws. That was a joke. If you're an Italian here today, we love you. Pizza, gelato, fantastic. All right. John 8. Jesus says this in arguing with the religious leaders. He says, "You are of your father, the devil." Revelation 2:9, a favorite verse of America's favorite anti-Semite, Candace Owens, talking about the Jews as the synagogue of Satan. And 1 Thessalonians talks about the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus. Matthew 21, Jesus tells the parable of the wicked tenants, where the Jews of the day are read as being the current tenants. And Acts 3 talks about you killed the author of life. So we don't have time to go into all of those. You could, if you're part of Linda's Farm Anglican, you could ask Chris to do a sermon series on these texts, and he could spend half an hour every Sunday morning unpacking what they really mean. But if you can't tolerate that, in broad brushstrokes, what you have here is texts that are an intra-group debate. Christianity, the Jesus movement, was a subgroup of first century or Second Temple Judaism. And in the Bible and in Jewish theology, it is full of critiques of the failure of the Jewish leaders. Because here's the thing about the Bible. When you read the Bible story, pretty much from Genesis chapter 3 right the way through to the end, what you discover is every single person in the Bible story, with the exception of Jesus, is deeply, tragically flawed. And as a result of that, there is a constant refrain through the scriptures calling these flawed people who are leaders of God's people back to being faithful to God. Think of the first Jew, Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. He gets a covenant, eternal covenant from God, and one of the first things he does is he pimps out his wife to save his skin. Right? That's just because the Bible is so brutally realistic about the human condition. And these texts occur in that context of Jesus critiquing the religious leaders of the day as he stands in the long line of biblical prophets who do that. It is illegitimate to read these texts as an ongoing critique of Jews today, applying those texts to the Jewish community today. And there's a principle in Christianity that you should not read one part of the Bible, a couple of texts, in a way that contradicts the broad sweep of the whole of Scripture. And I just cannot see, if you read all of Scripture, you can't come up with hating the Jews. You can come up with critiquing the Jewish leadership from within, as Jesus did, but you can't hate them. And you can't read the text in a way that leads you to hate them, unless it's a serious misreading. However, what animates this misreading is what has come to be called replacement theology. Now, the technical phrase for this is supersessionism, and it's a very early theological impulse in Christianity. And how it works is something like this, right? Plan A, the Jews, but they stuff up. So God goes to plan B, which is the church. Now, Marcion was a second century theologian, and he articulated this very thoroughly. And what Marcion said was, he took it even further than that. He said, listen, when you read the Hebrew Scriptures, you discover in this plan A, the God of the Old Testament is a horrible God, full of anger and smiting and judgment and fire and brimstone. And the Jews are a horrible bunch of faithless people, and it's the morals and the ethics and the life of the Old Testament's awful. When you come to the New Testament and you come to Jesus, you discover, the Kumbaya God. You discover grace and mercy and forgiveness and a gentle Savior. Okay, so you know what Marcion said? He said, you don't really even need the Old Testament. Let's just not just do away with the Jewish people. Let's just do away with the whole Old Testament and we'll be left with Jesus. Now, the church fathers got together, the early church leaders, and they denounced Marcion as a heretic because they said there is no Jesus who is not a Jewish Jesus. There is no New Testament without the Hebrew Scriptures. You can't understand the Christian Scriptures without the Hebrew Scriptures. And you'll never know Jesus unless you understand him as Jewish. Okay, so Marcion's decried as a heretic, but the impulse still lives on, plan A, plan B. So I say to some of my friends, a little cheekily, and maybe you think this yourself, I say to some of my friends, if you take the plan A, plan B metaphor, and you go, okay, plan A, Jews, didn't work, plan B, Christians, if God can change his mind and reject the Jews and renege on his covenant promises to the Jews, what's to stop him changing his mind about you? Because you're just as faithless, frail, feeble as any Jewish believer ever was. And of course, around the 7th century, in the middle of the desert, some bloke popped up with Plan C. Who was that? Muhammad. So Plan A, Judaism, Plan B, Christianity, Plan C, Islam. Islam is the ultimate replacement theology, supersessionism. And it should give pause to any Christian who is drawn to this, to go, no, you can't, that's a very dangerous path you're on once you start framing the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in those terms. Now, how else should we do it? There's some key passages, for example, Romans 11. Again, if you're not religious or Christian, this sounds a bit like an interior debate, but I'm just giving you the original documents and texts. And Romans 11 says extraordinary things like this. In this way, all Israel will be saved. So Rabbi Saul, the Apostle Paul, the halakhically observant Jewish rabbi and Pharisee who took the Torah and the values of the Torah and the teachings of Jesus as he experienced and incarnated and lived out the Torah, took that to the non-Jewish world. He says that God is not finished with the Jewish people. He also says it's a mystery how it's all going to work out. But he says that you Gentiles, or the technical phrase is you of the uncircumcised, you are grafted in. This is the miracle of Christianity, that in some mysterious way God, through his grace and mercy, has taken non-Jewish people and has grafted them into this root, so that now non-Jewish people can be participants in the covenant blessings of Israel. That's pretty cool. Now, people can argue about how exactly that works. I don't mind arguing that. But I think what is the root of what leads you almost inevitably to a form of anti-Semitism is the idea of a sequential replacement or supersessionism. Genesis 12, God's covenant with Abraham. John 4, Jesus says salvation is from the Jews. Ephesians 2, the writer to Ephesians talks about the creation of one new humanity, not one bunch being replaced, cast off, rejected. And in Romans 9, Paul talks about his love for Israel and the fact that Israel are the ones who have the oracles of God, the glory, theirs is the glory and the covenant. It's extraordinary. In fact, in Romans 15, the Apostle Paul is taking up a collection for the starving Jews in Jerusalem. There'd been a famine in the land. And so he writes a letter to the now largely non-Jewish church through the Roman Empire, the circular letter, to raise money for the Jews who are starving in Jerusalem. And he says to them, you owe a debt to the Jewish people because every spiritual blessing you have comes through the Jews. And then he says, pay up. Your spiritual debt has to be paid in tangible, practical support. I would suggest to the Christians of Australia and the Western world that we need to pay our debt to the Jewish people in our generation by standing in solidarity with them when the rest of the world turns against them and slaughters them. It just seems we should do that. So what do I conclude from all of that? Christianity is Jewish. I have a little ditty for you. Please don't criticize me if you're a theologian or you're a poet, because I'll likely offend both groups. Roses are reddish, violets are bluish. Thanks to Jesus, you all can be Jewish. Okay, so that's early Christianity for you, early Christian anti-Semitism. It gets worse. It gets so much worse as the centuries unfold and the divisions and Christianity gets institutionalized in the Roman Empire. Constantine becomes a Christian. It becomes tied up with the empire and all the power and the property of the empire. And by the medieval period, there is a massive religious understanding of the inferiority of the Jews. So the Jews in the medieval period are seen, you would have thought they would have learnt their lesson by rejecting Marcion, but no. The Jews are a living reminder of God's judgment on unbelief, exiled, wandering, permanently cursed, surviving to testify to Christian victory. Why has God kept the Jews alive? To testify to their evil and the fact they're under judgment and the Christians are victorious. That's why they are persecuted and miserable, the wandering Jews. They are a legally segregated caste, structurally marked as outsiders, living in ghettos, wearing special hats, wearing yellow badges with limited employment opportunities. My mum and her parents were German Jews in Frankfurt who fled in 1938. My family lived in the ghetto in Frankfurt. Economic scapegoating and usury stereotypes. Whenever anything goes wrong in the medieval period, who's to blame? The Jews. The Jews. If there's a plague, it's the Jews. If the crops fail, it's the Jews. And they're the money lenders who are greedy. Everyone loves a money lender when they lend you the money. No one loves the money lender when they say, hey, I'd like it back with interest, thank you very much. This is alive and well today. What's today? I met just yesterday. Is today Tuesday? Yes, I met yesterday with a Jewish friend of mine who runs a very large, successful private credit business. You know what his great fear is for the Jewish community at the moment? He said, because he's in an industry that's highly sensitive to interest rates, and he says the problem we're facing, the very scary prospect, as the ripple effects of the war in Iran go on, as interest rates go up, as people lose their jobs, who are they going to blame? The Jews. Because America's only in this because of the Jews. And now it's because the Jews have talked Trump and the US government into going into Iran that I'm losing my house. I'm losing my job. My kids have to come out of school. Okay, that's scary. That is scary, scary stuff that we are facing. Blood libel and murder myths, ritual murder myths. I don't know if you know this, but in the medieval period it was common to think that Jews slaughtered Christian babies and kids and used their blood in Passover sacrifices, mixed their blood into the matzah to use at Passover. Famous case, a 12-year-old boy, William of Norwich, died in 1144. A couple of years later, a monk rode into town and said, you know what happened to William? The Jews killed him. So then there was a pogrom and hundreds of Jews got murdered for the death of William of Norwich. The last pub, in 1912, this was repeated in New York City. A Christian kid disappears and his body's discovered, and a Catholic priest blames the Jews. And there's a pogrom in New York City in 1912. This blood libel and ritual murder libel is repeated. Every time someone says Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, indiscriminately targeting innocent civilians and targeting children. You will see this all the time, right? Online. The IDF is killing children. The IDF is killing children. It's a medieval blood libel. And I go, I say to him, and I've had Christian friends, clergy, pastors, who should know better, repeating this to me. And I think what breaks my heart, I say, why are you so quick to think the very worst of Jewish people and of the IDF? I said, do you know, the IDF, it's a civilian army. It's kids the age of my kids in their late teens and early 20s fighting against a vicious enemy to defend their grandparents and their parents and their little siblings at home. Why do you believe that they're trying to kill babies? Because you're repeating and recycling these medieval blood libels. There are periodic expulsions and forced conversions. Say in England in 1290, they kicked all the Jews out. They only got them back in a few centuries later when they looked across at Holland and they saw how they were prospering and they thought, why is Holland doing so well? It's all the Jews. Let's bring them back and help us grow our economy. France in 1306, France has a long history. They expelled the Jews multiple times. And then the infamous expulsion of the Jews in 1492. It wasn't racial, but it laid the groundwork for modern racial anti-Semitism. I just thought, some of you may know this fellow, Martin Luther. Luther was sparked off the Reformation in Germany, and towards the end of his life, he wrote this book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which in German is Von den Juden und ihren Lügen. Germans just sound always angry, ready to invade someone. For the purpose of hate speech laws, that was a joke. But this is a terrible treatise written by one of the most influential Christian theologians of the last 500-600 years. These are his suggestions for how to deal with the Jews. First, set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. Steal all their money. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brows. But if we're afraid that they might harm us or our wives, children, servants, cattle, etc., then let us emulate the common sense of other nations such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., then eject them forever from the country. Martin Luther. It's so important for us to understand the deep history of Christian anti-Semitism, because that is the soil into which Hitler's racial Nazi ideology was planted. We have this fantasy sometimes in the Western world that Germany and Europe were this wonderful, harmonious group of people, and the Jews all lived happily amongst them until Hitler came along and this charismatic, evil demagogue turned all of Europe against the Jews. That's just not true. All of Europe had hundreds of years of theologically justified Jew hatred that was the fertile soil into which Hitler's social Darwinianist, racist ideology could be planted. Do you know that in the Holocaust, somewhere between 20 and 30% of all the Jews who died were not killed by the Germans? Do you know who killed them? Their neighbors in Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. Their neighbors. Do you know when the last massacre of Jews happened in the Second World War? 1946. After the Germans had been defeated, 1,600 Jews were massacred in Poland as they returned to their villages and towns to try and get their property back from their neighbors, and their neighbors massacred them. Okay, so when we think about our culture, we are not that far from Germany in the 1940s. These tropes, this deep evil hatred is still woven into the DNA of Western civilization. And we have to be honest about it. And we have to see it for what it is. And when the Candace Owens and the Tucker Carlsons repeat these kinds of tropes, we have to call it out and go, you are just repeating 2,000-year-old anti-Semitic tropes. You've dressed it up in the context of anti-Zionism and the war in Gaza. But actually, many of them don't even bother doing that now. And you have to see it and call it out as the evil it is. Through the Enlightenment, the Jews assimilated. They were only accepted if they could cease being distinct. There was a period after the Enlightenment of a romantic nationalism where Jews were always framed as the cosmopolitan outsiders. And Jews are the flexible scapegoats. In the early 20th century, they were blamed for capitalism, the rich Jews who controlled all the capital, and for communism. That's how Hitler mobilized a lot of people, saying the Jews are all communists and we hate the communists. The Jews are blamed when they're powerful and they're blamed when they're weak. The Jews are blamed when they assimilate. Oh, you're just trying to assimilate and undercover, get in and control all of society. And then they're hated when they're separate because they don't mix and they keep to themselves. The Jews are hated when they're stateless, the wandering Jew who can't be trusted. And they're hated when they have a state. I actually find this is extremely hard for me to do night after night. It's so painful. But we have to face it. This is my family history. On my mum's side, and on my dad's side, they were the perpetrators. Anti-Semitism is an ideological virus that mutates to fit every era. Okay. That's depressing. Let's keep depressing you. The secular anti-Semitism of the 20th century. On the right, obviously, we saw it in the Nazis with their racial anti-Semitism. The Jews are polluting the human race, and like a bad gene, we need to excise it from the race. The Jews are the global elites. George Soros, the WEF agenda, the Jews controlled COVID, caused COVID, Jewish space lasers, chemtrails, I don't know, vaccines, you name it. The conspiracy theories abound about these global elites of the Jews. And of course, as Jews, we're our own worst enemy because we are spectacularly successful in almost every field of endeavor. The framing of the war in the Middle East is largely medieval Christian anti-Semitic tropes. That's why people just believe it. On the left, we have enormous anti-Semitism as well. In 1903, the Tsar of Russia's secret police constructed a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an anti-Semitic treatise condensing and putting into one nice little portable form all the worst lies about Jews, and was distributed in the Western world as a way of dividing the Western world and turning and doing damage to the Western capitalist world by turning the West against their Jewish population and therefore dividing and undermining the strength of the West to make way for a Marxist revolution. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion have been a bestseller in Arab worlds for a century. It's still a bestseller in Egypt. You could, I don't know if you still can, you could buy it in Muslim bookstores in Sydney and Melbourne. It is still read as a textbook in Pakistan, and you could read it in libraries and schools in the disputed territories, the West Bank in Israel and in Gaza, and many Muslim people believe this to be a historically accurate book. It comes straight out of the left as a Marxist plan to help destabilize the capitalist West. And then you have the Marxist colonial oppressor-oppressed framing. I did a lecture around the country last year on this, Much has been written about it, and the identity politics that Eric mentioned before, that all of humanity, you can be divided into groups, and the fundamental framing is you're either in the oppressor group or the oppressed group. And history, the world will reach its utopia, the world will be finally fully healed through a process of revolution. When the oppressed overcome the oppressors, then utopia arrives. In Marx, it was when the labor who are oppressed overthrew the capitalist class, then utopia would arrive. Obviously, that didn't work because the labor simply got rich and loved accumulating capital, and there was no revolution. But that framing has captured the moral imagination and the way people see the world. And into that framing, it has been incredibly easy for the left, in conjunction with Islam, to put the Jews as the ultimate oppressors and the Muslims, and in particular the Palestinians, as the ultimate oppressed. So this is how you can have, for example, Queers for Palestine, right? So in the oppressor-oppressed framing, obviously the queer movement would frame themselves as the oppressed by the patriarchal heteronormative society, but their oppression is a lesser oppression, and the oppression of the heteronormatives is a lesser oppression than the fundamental existential oppression of the Palestinians by the Jews. So the Palestinianism becomes the cause above all causes. The Jews and their state of Israel becomes the ultimate archetype of evil, and Muslims, and in particular Palestinians, become the archetype of the oppressed. And so a queer person in the streets of Melbourne or Sydney University will find the full freedom and utopian expression of their queerness only when the Palestinians overthrow the Israelis in this religious apocalyptic revolution. Okay, that is, and our kids get taught that every time your kid goes to primary school and gets told that they're a white colonial oppressor living on stolen land, unceded, never was, never will be. You are building the framework that primes people to believe in this framing of Israel and Islam and the Jews. It's a very toxic, damaging, it's an evil way of framing the world, and Israel is then in this presented as the unique evil. Strap yourselves in. Islamic anti-Semitism. In this mix, the world we're in now is a toxic result of three sets of ideas. You have the Nazi and medieval anti-Semitism that was imported into or exported into the Arab world in the 19th century. Egypt sent its leading young men to study in German and French universities, and they brought back the key Marxist and medieval anti-Semitic tropes and ideas into the elite of Egypt. And they also brought with them the Marxist colonial framing, particularly after 1948, with a guy called Franz Fanon in the post-colonial movement. And then they laid onto this Arab nationalism that said after the humiliation and defeat of the Ottoman Empire by the Allies in 1918, the way to regain honor in the world was to unite all the Arabs together against the Jews in particular and the West more generally. And then you add into that mix the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, and you have a straight line from the Hebron massacre of 1929 to October 7, 2023, and Bondi in December 14, 2025. So there's a straight line. These ideas have consequences, and they all result in dead Jews. You need to understand, we don't need to, it's a free world, you don't have to, but it's helpful to understand when the massacre of the Jews in Hebron, the persecution of Jews by Muslims during the period in which the British ruled Palestine, during the British mandate in Palestine, Jews were massacred by their neighbors. Long before they had a Jewish state, You can't blame, the state of Israel is the responsible, and the only reason there's any Islamic violence against the Jews is because of the state of Israel. That is a historic fallacy. There's a great book on this that I was reading on the Hebron massacre, and I was listening to it on audiobook as I drove through the streets of Sydney. And as they described what happened, I had to pull over because I was so disturbed. Because they could have been describing October the 7th. It's the same ritualized violence, the same orgiastic glee, the same sexual violence, the same throat-slitting body mutilation that happened on October the 7th. It is the same set of ideas that led to Hebron, led to October 7th, that led to those two guys standing on the bridge in Bondi. And you have to understand those ideas. Which leads me to what I think may be the most controversial slide of the night, if you understand its implications. And that is that, in my view, and again, I may be wrong, and I'm very happy to discuss this and debate, I would love to be proved wrong on this slide. But to the best of my knowledge, anti-Semitism is a feature, not a bug of Islam. In Christianity, it's a bug. In anti-Semitism, it's a feature. And what I want to show you is when you read the foundational texts of Islam, that they contain a substantial amount of Jew hatred. But before we get into that, it's important to make the following point. In our Western tradition, we believe that all people are equal, right? Every human being is made equal in the image of God. From Genesis 1, we get this. It's a revolutionary idea in human history, and it's unbelievably powerful. And that image of Godness, that value, is not eradicated by our evil acts. So the guys who stood on the beach at Bondi and shot Australians on our most iconic beach, they are loved by God, made in the image of God, uniquely valued by God. But not all ideas are equal. And cultures grow out of ideas. And by implication, not all cultures are equal because they're based on ideas that aren't equal. And so it's my firm conviction that one of the geniuses of our civilization is that we hold those two truths together and we say, you are equally valuable, but I think your ideas are wrong. And you think my ideas are wrong. Whoops. And the way we get to an approximation of truth is by arguing about ideas, while valuing each other as equally made in the image of God. Right? It is very personal for me. My brother converted to Islam. So I loved him, he loved me in our own peculiar ways. But we both believed each other to hold a set of very wrong ideas about the fundamental nature of reality. And we would argue about it all the time. And sorry to do this to you, but don't ask me about what my brother would think now, because he unfortunately got himself murdered 6 years ago in Cape Town, so he's no longer with us, and I don't know what he'd do after October 7. I don't know if we'd be able to have a civil discussion given the views he would, I suspect, have held. Nevertheless, in our day and age, the problem we have is because of the Marxist colonial settler framing and identity politics, we don't believe all people are equal anymore. As George Orwell famously said, some animals are more equal than other animals on the animal farm. So some groups are more privileged, others are less privileged. Pick your characteristic that separates you. But then we say, how do we then build a socially cohesive society if not all people are equal? If we've lost that fundamental biblical truth, all ideas are equal, like particularly when they're to do with religion and faith and values and God and all that stuff. They're all basically the same. And they're not. The very real risk we have, and the mistake we fall into, is we think about Islam and other religions through the eyes of our Western liberal assumptions. And for a bunch of people who are massively opposed to colonialism, it's ironically the most colonialist reading of Islam. Actually, when you invade Israel on the 7th of October, It's not motivated by your religion. It's really just a dispute over land and statehood. It's the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police standing up the day after Bondi and saying this was not a religious attack. That's just a Western liberal going, in my world, I can't possibly imagine that anyone on the basis of their religion would do evil, because religion is essentially benign and no one takes it that seriously. Like, religion is just what you do on a Sunday. You go to church for an hour and then you go and live your life. Maybe if you're Catholic, you go to confession on a Saturday night. Father, forgive me, for I'm about to sin. That's about it. Yeah, the Catholic got it, thanks. Yeah. That's Islam. That's an important thing, and I really believe that. So everything I say needs to be framed in the fact I believe every single Muslim person is made in the image of God, is as valuable as you or me. And there's no room in this for hating the person, while I may disagree vehemently with the ideas the person subscribes to. Make sense? Okay. So a quick introduction to Islam. The fundamental goal of Islam is to bring all of humanity into complete submission to Allah. Completely different vision of what life is about to Judaism or Christianity. It's not about human love, it's not about flourishing, it's not about creativity, it's not about personal development, it's not about justice, it's about submission. The way in which we know what this complete submission looks like is given to us in three primary sources: the Quran, the Sirah, which are the collection of the sayings of the Prophet, and the Hadith, the stories about the life of the Prophet. Three sources. And these sources together function as perpetual commands to be obeyed throughout time and in every possible context. The organizing principle of Islam is the Quran as interpreted and understood always through the life of the Prophet, which is given to us in these collections of sayings of what he said and stories about what he did. So the moral imagination of Islam always reverts back to 7th century Mecca or Medina. That's the plumb line of morality. To be a good human being is to live as much like the Prophet as you possibly can. So these function, they give us perpetual commands to be obeyed. By way of contrast, Judaism and Christianity separate the ongoing perpetual commands of their religion, for example, love of God, love of neighbor, from the historic provisions given to Israel as a nation state 3,000 years ago. For example, death penalty for adultery. If you're at Lindisfarne Anglican, hands up when last you heard Chris preach a sermon series calling for the death penalty for adultery. Has anyone ever heard a clergyman or a rabbi call for the death penalty for adultery? No. But it's there in the Old Testament, right? When God's setting up the nation state of Israel, there are provisions for adultery, Bronze Age. But the text itself in Judaism and Christianity moves on. And we have moved on, and we understand that this was time-specific, context-specific. In Islam, you can't do that. You always go back to the 7th century. You always go back to the life and the practice of Muhammad. Does that make sense? That's a vitally important piece to understand. Now, taken together, these texts provide guidance for how to organize every part of one's life. So they will tell you, if you're a Muslim, so I'd have these discussions with my brother, and you can see them online when you listen to the preachers, the imams online. They will give you every little detail. Islamic jurisprudence touches every single part of your life, from how you wipe your bottom after going to the toilet to how you organize your civil society and your politics and everything in between. Which foot you put, when you enter a toilet, which foot you put through the door first. Which leg you put into your trousers first if you're a man. Every little detail of your life is organized to try and most accurately walk in the footsteps of the Prophet. Now, of course, here's a question. How did Prophet Muhammad treat Jewish people? Six to 900 Jews he killed in Medina, in Khaybar. So when Muslims chant Khaybar ya Yahud, saying, the army of Muhammad will return. And you hear that chanted on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and New York and London and all through the Western world. What are they saying? They're saying to the Jews, the prophet murdered you, and we're going to as well. Okay. This goes far beyond what most Australians think about when they think about religion. The Islamic Republic of Iran, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah are all examples of political systems built on the perpetual commands of the foundational religious documents of Islam. The key question is Islam in Australia a religion or a political ideology? And the answer is yes. Okay, so more specifically, what does Islam teach about the Jews? If you weren't depressed, the following are some of the perpetual commands to followers of Muhammad regarding Jews. Sahih al-Bukhari, there are two most authoritative collections of hadiths that all Sunni Muslims will accept as authoritative, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim. Sahih al-Bukhari says this, commands Muslims to kill Jews in war with nature aiding their extermination. And this is presented as a perpetual duty. This is the infamous hadith, where the trees and the rocks cry out, "O Muslim, come, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill them." Creation itself aids in the slaughter of Jews before the end of the world. Quran 9:29 orders fighting Jews and Christians until they pay jizya in humiliation, enforcing a second-class dhimmi status as an eternal mandate. People say Jews lived in harmony with Islam in the Middle Ages. No, they lived as second-class citizens, ritually humiliated, as do Christians. When Islam spreads by conquest, which is the only way it spreads, pretty much, you have three choices when you're conquered. If you're a Christian or a Jew, you either convert to Islam, you leave, or you live as a second-class citizen, as a dhimmi, which means every year you go through a ritual humiliation, you put on rags, you approach the ruler on your knees, and you offer up your throat, and he taps your throat with a wooden stick, whereby you are saying every year in front of everybody, my whole life depends on me paying you this tax, and you as the ruler have the right to take my life if I don't pay the tax, because that's how the Prophet ordered it to be. Quran 5:51 forbids alliances with Jews, labeling them inherent enemies and equating friendship with apostasy. Quran 5:82 declares Jews the most intense enemies of believers, justifying perpetual hostility. And Quran 5:60 dehumanizes Jews as cursed apes and pigs, supporting eternal inferiority and anti-Semitic tropes. Fun fact from the Institute for the Study of Political Islam, the foundational text of Islam, the Quran, Sirah, and Hadiths, 9.3% of the content contains Jew hatred. This compares with 7% of Hitler's Mein Kampf. The foundational document of Nazi Germany is less anti-Semitic than the foundational documents of Islam. Now, dear friends, it is very important to say at this point, we're talking about the foundational documents of Islam, not every Muslim. Thank God, most Muslim people do not follow these commands. But a very large number of their religious leaders say that is a problem with Islam, and they should. A good Muslim is a Muslim who follows these commands. We think a good Muslim is a Muslim who's essentially a secular modernist who wants to live a good life and get along and basically ignores this stuff. I hope there are many more Muslims like that between you and me. The problem is, all it takes is one imam to get a young person and say, actually, look at these texts. This is how you should live. So this is a major challenge for the Muslim community in Australia and around the world, is how they deal with these large parts of their foundational texts that are violent because they are essentially a sacralizing of 7th century Arab warlord culture. And that is a challenge for Islam. And various Muslims are trying to address that. And then they end up getting killed by their co-religionists. So it's a big challenge. Lest you think now, as a non-Jew, you're like, whew, dodged that bullet, thank God I'm not a Jew. There's a saying in the Middle East, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And we should know, if you're a Christian person, you should know that jihadists are slaughtering Christians all around the world. It's actually not just a problem for the Jewish people, though of course it is in Australia at the moment. No one's slaughtering Christians here. But go to Nigeria. Go to Sudan. Go to Somalia. Go to Kenya. Go to Mozambique. Go to the DRC. Go to India. Yeah. You know, there have been since 9/11. Some of you may know this. Since 9/11, in the last 25 years, how many jihadist terror attacks have there been in the world? Somewhere in the order of 50,000 in 70 different countries. Okay, so that's depressing. Now you're all depressed. What do we do? What do we do? And apologies here, this may sound terribly religious and naive, but I think these are the best ideas around which we should order our common life. And these ideas from our Western tradition, which draw their roots from the Bible, the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures, these are the best ways to build social cohesion. And I don't think you've got to be religious. You don't have to believe in God to look at these ideas and go, this is how we get along with each other. Firstly, love your neighbor. Secondly, love your enemy. Those are hard things to do. Easy to say. They roll off the tongue. Love your neighbor, love your enemy. They're radically difficult. And part of our problem is we don't understand what love is. So we think love is a particularly strong, unconditional regard for someone else, often associated with romantic feelings. That's just a very narrow, small part of love. Love, at the very least, needs to be understood as willing and doing what is good for the other. One of our problems in our culture is we are relatively incapable of serious, thoughtful, moral reflection. It's hard to do that on TikTok, right? Actually, there are people who are trying. But so love is tricky. So we are to love our Muslim neighbors, and we are to love our Muslim enemies. And we're to love our right-wing anti-Semitic neighbors and our right-wing anti-Semitic enemies. But what does that look like? What does it mean to will and do what is good for a jihadist? The first thing you should do is deny them the opportunity to commit evil, because that's really bad for anyone to do evil, right? So stopping a jihadist having the means and the opportunity to kill a Jew or a Christian, that's a loving thing to do. Take away their weapons, surveil them, ensure they don't have the opportunity, and lock them up if they show any inclination of doing it. And deport them if need be. Like, that's just a loving thing to do, so they can't kill someone here. That's loving them. If they've committed a crime, then the loving thing to do is to prosecute them and bring justice to bear on them, because that's a loving thing to do. How is it loving to lock someone up? We execute justice upon someone in the hope that they will see the evil that they've committed and repent, and perhaps find forgiveness and a better path in life. So love can be understood as having teeth, because we take people and the evil in their hearts with great seriousness. Okay, but we have to love people. I really believe Christians and Jews need to lead this battle against anti-Semitism, because this is our tradition. We understand this, and we're free of fear and we're free of hatred. The Bible says we're not to be afraid. The most commonly repeated command in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is do not fear, don't be afraid, because God is with us. So don't be afraid, because if you're afraid of someone, you're not going to think clearly about how to love them. By the way, love also means not just loving, in Australia it means loving our Jewish neighbors. We need to protect them. Anti-Semitism is not something that the Jewish community can solve. Now, they're an extraordinary community, resourced, creative, unbelievably resilient. But they can't solve this. 1.8 billion Muslims, hundreds of millions of right-wing Christians who are becoming anti-Semitic. expecting the Jews to solve anti-Semitism or even to protect themselves from anti-Semitism is like asking a woman who's being battered by her husband to stop burning the toast so you don't make him angry. You go, no, that's just victim blaming. This is a problem for all of us in Australia. Just as an aside, we should be loving our Nigerian neighbors as well and preventing them being slaughtered by jihadists in northern Nigeria to the extent we can. But by the way, I'll give you another little aside. How are we going for time? Yeah, okay. So who is your neighbor? When Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, a very well-known story that's gone into our moral imagination, who is my neighbor? My neighbor is somebody who has a need that I have the ability to meet. If you see someone in need and you have the ability to meet that need, they're your neighbor. So go and meet their need. Our neighbors exist not just in time, but through time. We have to love generations who are not yet born in this country, because the decisions you and I make, and we make as a civilization now, will shape the kind of country they get to live in 40 years' time. Vital. And we have the ability to shape those decisions now because everybody's got the vote. And you can be a responsible citizen, and you can become an activist, and we can shape our public policy so that our grandkids get to live in a country where everybody is safe and free, not a balkanized, tribal, Islamized, racist country. And we're to overcome evil with good. And we're to work for cultural renewal. I'm going to be saying a whole lot more about that in the months and years ahead. A renewal of faith. We need a transcendent purpose to live for. We need a renewal of family. And we need a renewal of flag, love for this country. We need all of those things. Okay, so what does that actually look like in practice? Our vision is to build a citizen movement of activists. We have a bunch of people who are our opponents, and there's 4 groups of people, and we want to find people who could be our friends. We want to turn them into our friends. We want to educate them, turn them into allies, and then mobilize them. So together we'll build a global community of allies, people who understand the civilizational battle and understand that how a society treats its Jewish community as a window to its soul, and so we have to eradicate anti-Semitism. And by doing that, we will bring about the kind of cultural and national renewal that will be good for all of us and for every minority in this country. And then we need ongoing equipping, a chapter in every electorate, and we want to hold our leaders to account. A citizen movement to shape public opinion and hold elected officials to account. Chapters in every electorate, I'm repeating myself, allies in every domain of society. And this is the question: if your policies do not help us win the clash of civilizations, you get voted out. I don't care which party you're in. What are your policies actually, what are they delivering on the ground? Another way of putting it, which isn't on the slide, but I'll tell you anyway, it's a little more polemical or pointed. We want people all around this country to think about our country and our elected officials and go, is your policy going to make the Jewish community of Australia more or less safe? There's lots to think about when you go to vote. When you go to vote for your local council, state, federal members. But if we do our job, at least one of the things people should be thinking about is, what are their policies like about Western civilization? What are their policies about the Jews? What are their policies about Israel? Tell me what someone thinks about the Jews, tell me what they think about Israel, and I'll tell you what their underlying worldview and commitments are, right? And my dream is that we have a couple of 100,000 people spread across every electorate who have that on the front of mind when they go to vote, and encourage other people to think about that. And when they bump into their local councillor or their state MP or their local MP at Woolies doing the shopping, they go up to them and go, I'm really worried about the way Jewish people are being treated in Australia. I'm really worried about the Islamization of our country and creeping Sharia. I'm worried about polygamy. The fact that polygamy is tolerated in Australia in our social services. Did you know that? I want people over time to this isn't for everyone, but I want people over time to be able to go to their politicians. You'll have no Jews in your electorate. You might be somewhere in outer Whoop Whoop, But go up to your politician and go, you know what, I think if you really care about the rights of women, you will always oppose any immigration policy that allows people into this country who believe in female genital mutilation, the taking of sex slaves in war, and the permanent subordination of women to men. I just don't think people like that, ideas like that, have a place in our country. What do you think as you're at the checkout in Woolies? Politicians respond to conversations like that, and they go, oh, shoot, I hadn't thought about that. Think about it, because in your electorate we care about the role of women and the freedom of gay people to be gay if they want to be gay without being thrown off buildings, right? We just need to relentlessly, over the next 20 years, have these conversations and shape public policy in a way that brings about freedom and safety for all. What are we doing? As we've got here, we are rebranding to be called Allies for a Strong Australia, because this is our vision. Our goal is, the mission is unchanged. We want to make anti-Semitism unthinkable, but we want to build allies everywhere, and we're going for a brand that everyday Aussies who don't get Jewishness, don't get the Holocaust, can resonate with. And we'd love you to join a chapter. We've got our wonderful chapters here, organizing events like this. How brilliant is this? And this is happening all around the country. So we are part of this grassroots movement that has already far exceeded what I thought we could achieve. But it's happening everywhere. So sign up, join up, and then encourage your friends to sign up. The first step is get the weekly emails. I'll spam you for the term of your natural life. And then we'll get the word out, and together we can build a country where and I'll finish here and take some questions. This is my vision. It's a simple one. I want Australia to be a place where my great-grandson can wear a kippah and tzitzis in public if he wants to, and my great-granddaughter can wear a skimpy bikini to the beach without fear of being assaulted or attacked. Because that's Australia, right? Let's have that kind of freedom and that kind of security. And if that's going to be the case for my great-grandkids, we need to act now, and we need to be involved now.